In 2015, the world of high-performance computing had one undisputed king: Intel. The company was a titan, a cultural and technological icon whose market capitalization stood at a colossal $162.77 billion. Its rival, Advanced Micro Devices, or AMD, was little more than an afterthought, a company on life support with a market cap of just $2.27 billion, less than 2% of Intel's value. For decades, Intel's dominance felt like a law of physics. Yet, by the summer of 2022, the unthinkable happened. For the first time in history, AMD's market capitalization surpassed Intel's. This wasn't just a momentary market fluctuation. It was the result of a tectonic shift in the very foundation of the technology world. How does a company with a 90% market share and record-breaking revenues lose its crown? And how does its rival, a company drowning in over $2 billion of debt and reeling from a decade of failed products, engineer one of the greatest comebacks in corporate history? This is the story of a single, monumental bet. It's the story of a decision made at a moment of crisis, a bet on a new partner, a new way of making things, and a new vision for the future of computing. This is the story of the alliance that toppled an empire. To understand the fall, you must first understand the sheer scale of the empire. In the mid-2000s, Intel wasn't just a company, it was the bedrock of the digital age. Its processors powered the world's data centers, its brand was a household name, and its manufacturing prowess was the stuff of legend. But beneath the surface of this seemingly invincible fortress, the foundations were beginning to rot. The semiconductor industry has long been defined by two competing business models. The first is the integrated device manufacturer, or IDM. An IDM, like Intel, is a vertically integrated behemoth. It designs the chips, and it manufactures them in its own multi-billion-dollar fabrication plants, or fabs. For decades, this was seen as Intel's greatest strength, an unbreachable competitive moat. By controlling every step of the process, Intel could perfectly tailor its chip designs to the unique characteristics of its manufacturing lines, creating a powerful synergy that no competitor could replicate. In 2015, Intel still conducted 70% of its wafer fabrication in the United States, a point of national pride and perceived supply chain security. The second model is the fabless/foundry system. Companies like Nvidia, Qualcomm, and a struggling AMD were fabless. They were brilliant at designing chips, but they owned no factories. They outsourced the incredibly complex and capital-intensive manufacturing process to specialized companies called foundries. The undisputed leader of the foundry world was a Taiwanese company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC. This model was capital-light, flexible, and allowed designers to focus exclusively on what they did best: design. In 2015 and 2016, Intel's IDM model appeared triumphant. The company posted record full-year revenue of $59.4 billion in 2016, a 7% increase from the prior year. Its client computing group, which makes chips for PCs, generated $32.9 billion alone. They were a financial juggernaut, returning an astonishing $7.5 billion to stockholders in 2016 through dividends and buybacks. But this model, the very source of Intel's power, was also a double-edged sword. The tight coupling of chip design and in-house manufacturing meant that a failure in one area would catastrophically cripple the other. If the manufacturing roadmap stumbled, Intel's world-class chip designers had nowhere else to go. They were trapped. This dynamic created immense internal pressure to maintain the public facade of manufacturing superiority, even as the fundamental physics of Moore's law made progress exponentially more difficult. The model that built their empire had become a golden cage, locking them into a single high-risk path that allowed for no margin of error. For nearly a decade, Intel's relentless progress was choreographed by its famous tick-tock model. Introduced in 2007, it was a simple, powerful, and predictable two-year rhythm that the entire industry set its watch to. A tick was a die shrink, moving to a new, smaller, and more advanced manufacturing process, for example, from 22 nanometers to 14 nanometers. This made the transistors smaller, more power efficient, and cheaper to produce. A TOC, coming the following year, was a brand new microarchitecture built on the now mature existing process. This delivered a major leap in performance and features. This model was more than an engineering strategy, it was a marketing masterpiece. It projected an aura of unstoppable, predictable innovation. Wall Street loved it, customers depended on it, and competitors feared it. It worked flawlessly for years, a testament to Intel's engineering discipline. But the clock was about to run out. The model first hiccuped with the 14-nanometer process, which arrived later than scheduled. But the real collapse came with the next tick, the planned move to 10 nanometers. It was a failure of historic proportions. In March 2016, Intel quietly announced it was officially abandoning the tick-tock model. In its place came the process architecture optimization model. This was a public admission that the 2-year cadence was dead. PAO was a 3-step process, effectively stretching out each manufacturing node by adding an optimization phase. This resulted in a parade of processors: Kaby Lake, Coffee Lake Refresh, Comet Lake, all built on iterative refinements of the same 14 nanometers process, a technology that was supposed to be superseded in 2016, but ended up powering Intel's flagship products all the way into 2021. The death of tick-tock was the first major, public crack in Intel's armor. It was a signal to the entire industry that the King's manufacturing leadership was no longer absolute. For the first time in a decade, Intel's roadmap was unpredictable and, more importantly, vulnerable. The marketing engine, which had promised perpetual progress, had finally outrun the engineering reality. The 10-nanometer process was supposed to be the tick that followed the 14-nanometer Skylake architecture in 2016. It didn't arrive. It was delayed to 2017, then 2018, then 2019. When it finally shipped in volume in mid-2019, it was only for low-power laptop chips that couldn't reach the high clock speeds needed for desktop PCs or servers. High-performance 10-nanometer parts wouldn't become a reality for years, leaving Intel's most lucrative market segments stranded on an aging manufacturing node. This wasn't just a delay, it was a fundamental technological breakdown born from hubris. Decades of being the undisputed leader had created a corporate culture that believed it could brute force its way through any engineering challenge. This led Intel to make multiple, simultaneous, high-risk bets on its 10-nanometer process. First, they pursued what they called hyperscaling, aiming for an unprecedented 2.7 times increase in transistor density over their 14-nanometer node, far more aggressive than a typical generational leap. It was a bet-the-company move designed to crush the competition for years to come. Second, to achieve this without mature extreme ultraviolet (EUV) lithography tools, they relied on incredibly complex and error-prone multi-patterning techniques. In some cases, a silicon wafer had to be exposed to light up to 6 separate times just to draw a single feature. This complexity destroyed manufacturing yields, making the chips prohibitively expensive to produce. Third, they introduced risky and unproven materials and design features all at once. They switched to cobalt for the chip's tiny internal wiring, but the new material proved to be brittle and a poor conductor of heat, creating hot spots and microscopic fractures that killed chips. They also implemented a novel technique called contact over active gate, COAG, a design that maximized density but left absolutely zero margin for manufacturing error. The failure was palpable. The very first 10-nanometer chip, codenamed Cannon Lake, finally shipped in 2018 in a single low-volume model for the Chinese market. It was so flawed that its powerful integrated graphics had to be completely disabled just to get it to work at all. It wasn't a product launch, it was a proof of life for a process that was effectively dead on arrival. Inside Intel, engineers reported a punishing culture of 7-day work weeks and impossible deadlines, as management tried to solve fundamental physics problems with sheer force of will. Intel wasn't just beaten by a competitor, they beat themselves. Their culture, born from decades of monopoly, made them incapable of the pragmatic, risk-managed engineering required to stay on the cutting edge. In contrast, TSMC pursued a strategy of more modest improvements, but way more predictable. While Intel was trapped in its 10-nanometer nightmare, it created a multi-year window of opportunity for a rival to do the unthinkable: leapfrog the king. While Intel was wrestling with the burdens of its success, AMD was dealing with a very different problem: the consequences of its failure. By 2015, the company was a shadow of its former self, a cautionary tale of what happens when you lose a technological arms race. But it was from this position of weakness that AMD would find the courage to make the biggest gamble in its history. To say AMD was struggling in the mid-2000s is an understatement. The company was on the verge of financial collapse, largely due to the catastrophic failure of its Bulldozer CPU architecture. Launched in 2011, Bulldozer was a radical new design that was supposed to challenge Intel. Instead, it was a disaster. The chips had abysmal single-core performance, or low instructions per clock, meaning they were slow in the vast majority of consumer applications. They consumed enormous amounts of power, ran incredibly hot, and in many benchmarks were even slower than the older AMD processors they were meant to replace. The failure was so complete that it led to a class action lawsuit for false advertising, which AMD later settled for $12 million. The financial fallout was brutal. For the full year of 2015, AMD's revenue fell by 28%. In the final quarter of that year, the company posted a net loss of $79 million on revenues of just $958 million. They were carrying $2.27 billion in debt, and their entire market value was just $2.27 billion. Their share of the lucrative server market had dwindled to a mere 2%. But this near-death experience became a catalyst for radical change. Unlike Intel, whose success bred complacency, AMD's failure forced a complete cultural and strategic reset. They had no legacy to protect and nothing left to lose. This desperation created the perfect environment for a new leader to make bold, company-defining bets that a more successful, conservative company would never have dared to make. That new leader was Dr. Lisa Su. An MIT-educated engineer with a PhD in electrical engineering, Su took the helm as CEO in October 2014. She understood that AMD's problems weren't just financial, they were fundamentally technical. Their products were simply not competitive. Her strategy was a masterclass in focus. She laid out a clear vision to stabilize the struggling PC business while concentrating AMD's limited resources on what mattered most: developing a single, high-performance computing architecture that could compete again. The centerpiece of this strategy was a completely new microarchitecture, codenamed Zen. It was a clean sheet design, throwing away the flawed concepts of Bulldozer and starting from scratch. The core promise was audacious: a massive 40% improvement in instructions per clock over their previous generation. It was a number so ambitious that it was met with widespread skepticism from an industry that had watched AMD fail for years. The first glimmers of hope appeared in early 2017 with the launch of the first Zen-based CPUs, the Ryzen 1000 series. Manufactured on a 14-nanometer process by AMD's former manufacturing arm, Global Foundries, these chips weren't quite able to beat Intel's best, but they were shockingly competitive. For the first time in nearly a decade, AMD was back in the game. Since spinning off its factories into Global Foundries in 2009, AMD had been a fabless company out of necessity. Their initial Zen products were made at Global Foundries, and the public roadmap showed that their next-generation 7-nanometer products would be too. But in August 2018, a bombshell dropped. Global Foundries announced it was halting its 7-nanometer development indefinitely. The cost of competing at the leading edge had become too great, and they were pivoting their business to focus on less advanced, more profitable technologies. This was the moment of truth for Lisa Su and AMD. Their entire future was staked on the performance and efficiency gains of the 7-nanometer process. With their primary manufacturing partner suddenly out of the race, they faced a potential catastrophe. In this moment of crisis, Su made the single most important decision in AMD's history. She decided to move all of AMD's next-generation 7-nanometer products, both CPUs and GPUs, to a single external partner, TSMC. What began as a crisis response became a masterstroke. AMD's original plan had been to dual-source its 7-nanometer chips using both TSMC for GPUs and Global Foundries for CPUs, a standard industry practice to mitigate risk. Global Foundries' withdrawal forced AMD to abandon this safety net and go all in with one foundry. While this appeared to be a moment of extreme vulnerability, it inadvertently forged what would become a secret alliance. By committing their entire high-volume leading-edge portfolio to TSMC, AMD instantly became one of the Taiwanese foundry's most important customers, second only to Apple. This deep strategic commitment granted them preferential access to TSMC's production capacity and fostered a level of deep engineering collaboration that they never would have achieved by splitting their orders. The bet wasn't just on TSMC's technology, it was on the strategic power of becoming an indispensable partner to the world's best manufacturer. A forced hand had become a winning one. The years 2018 and 2019 marked the inflection point. It was the period where Intel's self-inflicted wounds began to fester, just as the strategic alliance between AMD and TSMC began to bear fruit. The convergence of these two trajectories would not just level the playing field, it would flip it entirely. The contrast between the two companies' manufacturing roadmaps during this period was stark. While AMD was successfully taping out multiple 7nm product designs at TSMC, Intel was still mired in its 14nm holding pattern. Intel's first volume 10nm chips, the Ice Lake processors for laptops, wouldn't ship until the middle of 2019, and even then, they were plagued by low clock speeds and limited supply, making them unsuitable for high-performance desktops and servers. TSMC, on the other hand, was executing with flawless precision. Having started volume production of its first-generation 7nm process, N7, in 2018, they were already ramping up their second-generation 7nm plus, N7 Plus process, which incorporated advanced EUV lithography, by 2019. Their progress was relentless and, most importantly, predictable. This manufacturing advantage was amplified by a revolutionary design philosophy from AMD, the chiplet. Instead of designing a single, large, monolithic processor die, the traditional approach favored by Intel, AMD's Zen 2 architecture broke the CPU into smaller, modular pieces. The core of the processor, the CPU cores themselves, were grouped into small 8-core chiplets, called Core Complex Dies, or CCDs. These were manufactured on TSMC's cutting-edge, expensive 7nm process. These high-performance chiplets were then connected to a separate, larger I/O die that handled tasks like memory control and connectivity. This I/O die was manufactured on a cheaper, more mature 12nm process at AMD's former partner, Global Foundries. This chiplet design was a stroke of genius, perfectly suited to the fabless foundry model. Manufacturing large, complex chips on a brand-new process is notoriously difficult, and yields, the percentage of working chips per silicon wafer, are often very low. By producing small, identical 7nm chiplets, AMD dramatically increased its yields. A tiny defect on a wafer might ruin one small chiplet, but not an entire massive CPU. This approach minimized risk, maximized the output of the expensive 7nm wafers, and optimized cost in a way that Intel's monolithic, in-house model simply could not match. It was a manufacturing advantage born from a design philosophy. In July 2019, the Alliance unleashed its first major product on the consumer market, the AMD Ryzen 3000 series of desktop CPUs. The launch sent shockwaves through the industry. The flagship Ryzen 9 3900X offered 12 high-performance cores for $499, while Intel's top-of-the-line consumer chip, the Core i9900K, offered only 8 cores for a similar price. For the first time in more than a decade, AMD was not just competitive, it was dominant. Productivity performance. In multi-threaded applications like video rendering, 3D modeling, and file compression, the Ryzen 9 3900X's core advantage was overwhelming. Benchmark after benchmark showed it absolutely crushing the Intel i9-9000K, often delivering 30 to 40% more performance. Gaming. Performance. In PC gaming, traditionally Intel's stronghold, the i9-9900K's higher clock speeds still gave it a slight edge in some titles. However, the difference was often a marginal few frames per second, a gap that disappeared entirely at higher resolutions where the graphics card becomes the bottleneck. For the vast majority of users, the performance was effectively tied. Power efficiency. The most telling metric was power consumption. Thanks to the efficiency of TSMC's 7nm process, the AMD chips used significantly less power than Intel's power-hungry 14nm++ parts. The 8-core Ryzen 7 3700X, for example, delivered multi-threaded performance on par with the i9-9900K, while consuming nearly half the power under full load. The Ryzen 3000 series was a massive commercial and critical success. It completely reset the industry's expectations for price to performance and forced a stunned Intel into a defensive price war. The revolution had begun. If the Ryzen launch was a revolution, what came next was a conquest. Just 1 month later, in August 2019, AMD launched its second-generation EPYC server processors, codenamed Rome. This was a direct assault on Intel's most profitable and protected market, the data center. Using the same 7nm chiplet design, EPYC Rome chips offered an unprecedented 64 cores per processor. Intel's best Xeon scalable processors at the time, still stuck on 14nm, topped out at just 28 cores. The impact on the server market was even more profound than on the desktop. Data center customers are ruthlessly rational. They don't care about brand loyalty. They care about total cost of ownership, TCO, a cold calculation of performance, power consumption, and density, the number of cores you can fit in a server rack. On every single one of these metrics, EPYC Rome was superior. Raw performance. For workloads like virtualization, cloud computing, and data analytics, Rome's massive core count advantage delivered a generational leap in multi-threaded performance. Performance per watt. The 7nm process efficiency meant that a 64-core EPYC server consumed significantly less power than a dual-socket Intel server with fewer total cores, drastically lowering electricity and cooling costs for data center operators. Connectivity and I/O. EPYC also offered more PCIe lanes for high-speed connectivity to GPUs and storage, as well as more memory channels, making it a far more capable platform for modern, data-intensive workloads. This was the bet that truly broke Intel's monopoly. The server market was the financial engine that had funded Intel's dominance for decades. By launching a product that was undeniably superior for the industry's most lucrative and demanding customers, AMD and TSMC had struck at the heart of the empire. The market's reaction was swift and decisive. The data paints a clear picture of a historic transfer of power. As the table shows, AMD's market share in the desktop segment nearly tripled, while its presence in the server market went from a rounding error to nearly a quarter of all units sold. This relentless advance came directly at Intel's expense. Wall Street's verdict was even more dramatic, as reflected in the company's market capitalizations.